Okay, I think we'll get started. So kia ora koutou. I'm Amelia Sharman, Director of Sustainability Reporting here at the External Reporting Board. And with me today, I have Karen Tipper, Technical Director, Audit and Assurance. And we will be going over the consultation that we launched this Wednesday on proposed 2025 amendments to climate and assurance standards. Please put all your questions into the Q&A function. We will aim to get to all the questions at the end of the webinar, but if there's too many and we can't get to them all, we will aim to respond to you separately. So it might be a good idea if you want to put your name against your questions so we can get back to you. We will make the slides of this presentation and a recording available on the events page on the XRB website of pretty much as soon as possible after this webinar, as well as you can always check the consultation document, which we have a link to. Thank you for joining us, and yeah, let's get started. So today we're going to run through basically the main content of the consultation document, so what we're consulting on in general, and then I'll hand over to Karen and she'll talk about the Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions reporting and assurance proposal. I'll come back to you to talk about the anticipated financial impacts proposal, and then we'll get to how you can provide feedback on the consultation. So we're consulting on the proposed extension of certain adoption provisions. Specifically, we're consulting on extending the adoption provisions relating to the reporting and assurance of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and as well then as the adoption provision relating to the reporting only of anticipated financial impacts. And both of those, we're proposing extensions of 2 further reporting periods over and above what is currently in NZCS 2, the adoption standard. And just a little plug at the bottom of the screen there for our standards navigator. If you haven't used it, it's all of our standards on the XRB website in HTML format, which hopefully makes it easier for you to get around and read them. All standards are obviously also available in PDF format. So before we get started into the proposals, we do really want to acknowledge the efforts that are currently being made to report and, as required, assure these really important requirements. They are both integral components of the climate-related disclosure framework. On the Scope 3, they are really important because those emissions do often represent the most significant climate-related risks and opportunities for an entity. They are a useful input into the credible transition planning, and they are an increasingly common international ask for access to capital. The mandatory reporting enhances the transparency to support investor decision-making, and then the assurance enhances the trust and confidence in that information, reducing the risk of greenwashing. On anticipated financial impacts, we know that the disclosure of the anticipated financial impacts of the climate-related risks and opportunities helps investors to assess how those factors may affect an entity's financial position, financial performance and cash flows over time. They are really helpful with transparency, supporting that informed decision making, and also demonstrating the credibility of an entity's strategy and transition planning. We really acknowledge the significant implementation efforts so far on both of these disclosure requirements and on the voluntary assurance that some people have been getting. And it really is that sometimes only when those efforts are being made that the extent of any challenges become apparent. And I think that is particularly apt for our next section. So I'll hand over to you, Karen, to look at the Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions reporting and assurance.
Thank you, Amelia. So our first proposal in this proposals to extend some of the adoption provisions is, as Amelia said, to extend the reporting or disclosure of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions and the associated and connected assurance of those greenhouse gas emissions by a further 2 reporting periods. So the next question is why we are consulting. So our role as standard setter requires us to be kept informed and stay informed about issues relating to the implementation and adoption of new standards. And we recently issued a consultation on international alignment of climate reporting, and we heard that some comments on the disclosure and assurance of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and that these were continuing to be a challenge for some climate reporting entities. So we reached out and talked to and did a series of targeted interviews with people that we had heard from. And in these interviews, we heard the following. We heard that there are currently some significant uncertainties, and these could be in relation to the boundary definition of Scope 3 emissions disclosure. So what is required to be included within that boundary and potential scope creep within those boundaries. We heard that there are still continue to be some discussions around gaps in methodology and potentially some interpretation issues. And we also heard about New Zealand being potentially out of step with international requirements. And these international requirements we are following quite closely. We note that due to some of these data quality and methodology gaps, the current disclosure reliability may not be as useful as anticipated to primary users. So on the assurance side, we have been continually monitoring the uptake and the use and the assurance of Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions within the climate statements. And we recently issued our snapshot of this on our website. We note, and when we consulted last year, we looked into the availability of service organizational control type 2 reports. And we have looked into this again for this year and this consultation, and we understand that these are still not widely available. Now, these reports are reports which cover the controls and in place at a service organization, so potentially a data provider. We also understand that systems are still emerging to enable reliable data. And the current quality of data due to timing is still emerging. And again, we heard similar comments around international requirements. So we are proposing a 2-year extension to both the reporting and the assurance adoption provision together. And this will enable time for the XRB to produce and support additional guidance material and clarifications. And some of you may have seen some of the guidance material that we have produced this year. We have been doing a data series on greenhouse gas emissions assurance and disclosure, and have produced some guidance in relation to data uncertainty and exclusions. It also gives time to potentially introduce differential reporting if warranted, depending on the government's decisions about the CRD regime. But it also gives time for more information to become available from local and international sources. As Europe and Australia and others continue their journeys with these reporting and assurance requirements, it enables this information to become available. And on the assurance side, it also provides time for data providers to continue their work that they have commenced towards an industry-wide solution for assurance requests from multiple customers. And we consider that the same extension for both reporting and assurance is appropriate to give additional time for these methods and systems to improve, to enable both the reporting and the assurance over the Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. So I briefly wanted to talk now about how the adoption provisions work together. So firstly, if you are currently disclosing your greenhouse gas, currently under the requirements, you are required to disclose and assure your Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions if you are not using any adoption provisions. But if you use an adoption provision and you decide not to disclose your Scope 3 emissions disclosure, you will need to use adoption provision 4, which relates to the disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions. You will not need to use adoption provision 8 because there is no disclosure to disclose. There is nothing that is included on the Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. Option 2 would be that you could, as a CRE, choose to disclose a subset of your greenhouse gas Scope 3 emissions and choose not to assure these. If you choose to do this, you would need to disclose that you used adoption provision 4 that relates to the disclosure of your scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, and you would need to use adoption provision 8 that relates to the assurance of these emissions. And option 3 could be that you disclose all of your scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, but you choose not to obtain assurance over these greenhouse gas emissions. If this is the case, you would use adoption provision 8, which relates to the assurance of greenhouse gas scope 3 emissions. Just as a point to note, scope 1 and scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions are required to be disclosed and assured, and they are being disclosed and assured this year. If you do choose to use an adoption provision, you are required to disclose the use of that provision. And if you disclose your scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, but you do not assure those greenhouse gas emissions, you are required to clearly identify that these have not been assured. And I will hand back to Amelia to talk about our next proposals.
Amazing. Thank you, Karen. And I can see some questions coming in for Q&A, so do please put those in and we'll get to them at the end. So I'm going to be talking about the anticipated financial impacts adoption provision and what are we proposing. So same as with the greenhouse gas emissions, we are proposing extending this by 2 further reporting periods. Why are we consulting about this and why do we have this proposal? 2 main factors. Firstly, there's really significant international uncertainty about anticipated financial impacts, and I do want to emphasise that that is very recent, some of these developments. So what is happening? Firstly, in Europe, so the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, many of you will know about the Omnibus simplification process that they have going on. And one of the options around this disclosure requirement of anticipated financial impacts is to allow a permanent exemption from quantification. This would significantly change the expectation around anticipated financial impacts as a disclosure. We then very recently, just the week before last, the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, put out educational material on their expectations of anticipated financial impacts, which they call anticipated financial effects, just to try and clarify for their perspective what is the expectation around the quantification, what does need and doesn't need to be disclosed. We have heard that it is very challenging for climate reporting entities to deal with this uncertainty, particularly, as Karen mentioned, when we have a very clear signal that this international alignment of climate reporting is very important both for climate reporting entities and for the users of the information. We are keeping very close eye on what is happening here, and do please have a look in the consultation document where there is a bit more information around, some of the expectations from that educational material. But yeah, in New Zealand, we do have some clear requirements that if you are unable to disclose quantitative information, you must explain why that's the case. And so if an extension provision was an extension to an adoption provision was made, that requirement would remain unchanged. So if you, in the future, you would need to disclose your anticipated financial impacts, that kind of comply or explain provision would stay in force. But we do have some guidance in our all sectors material on current expectations on anticipated financial impacts. And then the second thing we heard was there is a need to provide more clarity and support to climate reporting entities. We did publish in July this year some staff guidance on framing the internal conversations on anticipated financial impacts, and we do consider that is, that gives entities a sufficient basis to do their first reporting on this topic. But we are aware that more detailed how-to guidance is not yet available either domestically or internationally on this. We are working with the New Zealand Society of Actuaries, who are experts in understanding risk and tail risk and all those important factors that go into this topic. But we have been clearly communicated to that ensuring we give sufficient time to embed guidance material is really, really important. So what we are thinking is an extension to adoption provision 2 would give time for us to continue that work on guidance. It would give time to embed that guidance material. An and particularly around understanding of the range of disclosures that may provide material information. You know, we are very conscious that qualitative information is relevant here, but in certain circumstances, quantitative information is both available and more relevant. So we do just want also to have more time on the international requirements and the greater clarity to support New Zealand entities. And then, so that's a very quick whistle-stop tour through the consultation document, those two proposed extensions. Given the short consultation period, we are taking responses in an online survey. We are doing that because we really want to communicate as soon as we possibly can to the market about what the expectation is for next year on this disclosure requirement. So it is 3 questions in an online survey, but the most valuable to us is the reason. So please do give reasons for your answer. It really helps us to understand the rationale as to why you have a particular comment. You can see there we are closing, and it's a 3-week period. We will be making some decisions at our technical boards in October with the aim to communicate as soon as possible those decisions. One of the questions you may have is, why are we doing this again? We did this last year, why are we doing this again? And I think hopefully we've communicated just quite how uncertain and evolving the international landscape is, which makes it very difficult to have consistency in standard setting. We do want to be responsive to challenges in international context. And then it is really around learning from those implementation challenges, and things that we thought were going to be true are not true. So for example, we did hear last year that those SOC 2 reports that Karen was mentioning, that they would be available this year. We have gone back and talked to the data providers, etc., and that timing that we thought was going to happen, it has not eventuated. So we are just really trying to be responsive and give as much time, but acknowledge that this is a short time before next year's reporting kicks in. Okay, so just before we take the questions, I would plug, if you haven't received a climate alert on this topic, or if you haven't received an audit and assurance alert, please go onto the website and sign up for our materials. We have alerts on all 3 areas of standard setting that we do, and then we also have an XRB update, and then you can always follow us on LinkedIn, etc. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can hopefully see everyone's faces. And Karen, have we got some questions in the chat?
We have the first one. If CREs are struggling to measure the anticipated financial impacts, why can't NZCS 1 paragraph 15D be used? Please, can you explain why you think an extension of the adoption provision is required instead?
So yeah, so you absolutely can use 15D, that's the unable to quantify. What we want to be clear on is, that is unable to quantify. We want to be clear that if there is a reasonable expectation around quantification, that should be used. So it's the uncertainty around what is unable, what's reasonable, what is expected from a primary user. I think, we want to be clear that there is work required to be done both by the entity around its understanding of the impacts to then disclose, as well as what the primary user is wanting to see in terms of that quantification. I think something we have heard quite clearly is that it is a really valuable disclosure, because what it does help is when people do the work to think about the current and anticipated financial impacts, it does help circle back to say, well, are the risks and opportunities that I identified actually material? How are they, playing out in my climate statement as a whole? But at the same time, while we know it's important, we do know that the how to do that thinking is still very, very nascent, and we are trying to be as responsive as possible to the implementation challenges. I think the other thing I would 100% point out is these are adoption provisions. So these are completely voluntary to use. You need not use an adoption provision. The entity may wish to not use them and differentiate themselves in the market from those that do use them. It is entirely optional to use adoption provisions. So it's just about us hearing challenges, trying to provide the flexibility to entities to be able to do the work to have high quality disclosures.
Thank you. The next one, was consideration given to delaying some aspects of Scope 3, but not all? For example, financed emissions could be delayed, but not the supply chain. I can probably
Go for
say
that one, Karen.
a bit of this one. So yes, we did look into Scope 3. We did, from what we heard, the challenges were not limited to financed emissions. They were broader than financed emissions, so that did factor into our discussion. The other thing is that the adoption provision 4 does allow you to disclose a subset of your greenhouse gas, your Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. So with the additional optional time that we are proposing, you could, entities could disclose, parts of their greenhouse gas emissions and move to disclose more in the future. I don't know if you'd like to add anything on that, Amelia.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the point of that, the way that adoption provision is written is to not provide a hard stop. We really want people to be working forward, to be thinking about other categories that are material. Don't forget, materiality applies to all of this. But yeah, definitely the challenges we've heard go beyond financed emissions. We don't, because we don't specify a measurement standard that entities need to use, it would also be quite difficult for us to specify, which particular types and categories of, subset under Scope 3 would or wouldn't be able to be excluded, because the different measurement standards kind of cut it slightly differently. So we are trying to still provide that flexibility there.
Thank you. So the next question, were there any thoughts on correlating the application of AP4 and 8? Currently, AP4 is related to the reporting entity's first, second, and third year, but AP8 is related to calendar years. Means if you're heading into first reporting year, or if you're captured in 2 years, there will be a mismatch. Some entities will need to audit year 1, which is super challenging.
Do you want to start with that one, Karen, or I can?
Yeah, I can start with that one. So with the assurance adoption provision, the assurance is required by primary legislation. So that is my understanding of why the assurance provision is we can extend it by calendar years related to that, but it's due to the fact that the actual date for the commencement of assurance is in the primary legislation.
Yeah, and I think it's relating also to capability and capacity. So, for example, we've talked a lot about those SOC 2 reports. They will be, the aim is that the assurance will be able to use those and be a bit more settled, for example, in the systems and processes. So if you are an entity coming in, late, not at the beginning of the regime, we're very aware that these adoption provisions on the reporting do apply from whenever you start. We would probably expect to see, if there was a very large entity that came in late to the regime, they may not need to use the adoption provision. There might be market expectations that they wouldn't. But yeah, it's entirely voluntary whether you use them. It is about just trying to get this reporting regime going off the ground as well as we can. We would be looking, in the future, as we said, with the International Alignment of Climate Reporting, what would the most appropriate future standards look like? We have to recognise that some of the requirements, say, in the ISSB or the Australian standard around proportionality are different from the way we've done adoption provision. So there's a lot of thinking that we need to do into the future, but hopefully for an entity coming in, the adoption provisions as proposed would give enough flexibility to be ready. And if you are an entity, because don't forget, to be eligible to report, you must be large, meeting those size criteria for 2 reporting periods before you have to disclose. So we would encourage any entity that is in that position to be doing internal reporting to get ready for the external reporting.
Thank you. Is there any update to the consultation done earlier in the year by MB?
So yes, it's the government's decision making on they published that in December 2024. We are still waiting for, as you saw in the slides, and it's also in the consultation, we're still waiting for hearing back on what the government's decisions are. If the government's decisions come out, in the midst of this consultation period, we will consider with MB what, if any, changes need to happen to our work. But no, so that is definitely something that MB is in charge of for the government, rather than the XRB.
Excellent. Is there an intention for New Zealand to move to the ISSB standards?
Yeah, so as Karen mentioned, we in the what we heard on the International Alignment of Climate Reporting, we heard a very strong preference for international alignment, and the two most commonly mentioned standards were the ISSB's IFRS S2 and Australia's AASB S2, which is based on the IFRS standard. So we're very, very, but we also heard that a phased approach to change was really important, and that some form of recognition, so mutual or individual recognition from the regulator side, was also important. We are doing a lot of work internally around what does that alignment look like, that does move towards something that is demanded by the market and suitable for New Zealand entities. So yeah, we are thinking a lot about that, and we are hopefully we're paying very close attention to the reporting that is happening under IFRS S2. There's only a handful of statements, climate statements, that have come out using that standard, and obviously we haven't seen any AASB S2 standards. We're very, very aware that it is important, but we want to see what the reporting looks like. But yeah, it's definitely on the work program. But yeah, feel free to get in touch with us specifically if you want to know more information about that.
And next question. Sorry if I missed this, but why 2 years rather than 1?
Yeah, so really good question. Why 2 years rather than 1? We basically, to be perfectly frank, we don't want to be in this position next year having to extend again. We know it's really important to provide as much certainty as possible when setting regulatory requirements. We have reflected on what we heard last year, what we thought would be true, and the time that it takes to embed material, the time that it takes to get through some of these implementation challenges, the uncertainties, those boundary issues that Karen was talking about. And really what we wanted to do was give sufficient time to enable some of these challenges. And again, I would emphasize they are adoption provisions. You could make use of the adoption provision for 1 year. You would not have to make use of it for the full 2 years if the decision was made to extend for 2 years, or whatever period the boards decide to make those extension periods. Anything else you want to add on that one, Karen?
No, I think that covered everything. Thank you. So next question. Do you think it's possible that the AASB might also delay AFI? Quite a hard question to answer.
That's a really good question. We ask ourselves that as well. So yeah, and it's really interesting in the Australian regime. So it's interesting. The question was about AFI disclosure. So in the Australian regime, some of the requirements are put in primary legislation. So, for example, their scenario analysis requirements and their emissions reporting requirements are actually in the primary legislation rather than in the reporting standards. So they we expect would be much more difficult to amend those. Anticipated financial effects, as it is in the AASB standard, we don't know. Again, it's implementation challenge. I think we've been having a lot of communication with Australia, sharing the implementation challenges that we have seen here, and obviously Europe has also seen a lot of implementation challenges on its European sustainability reporting standards. So I can't speak to what the Australian government might decide to do or not do. But yeah, it's definitely something we are trying to communicate clearly to them, that the challenges that we are seeing, so that hopefully they can be aware and do a lot of implementation efforts to mitigate some of those. We are also quite aware. We put out standards And we were building the plane while we were flying it, doing the guidance at the same time. And in Australia, they do have the benefit of some of the guidance that we prepared. We do know, for example, that the transition planning guidance that we have here in New Zealand is being shared by Australian, I think it's the regulator, I'm not sure, to try and help Australian entities so get off the ground a bit faster.
Thank you. So the ability to report quantitative vulnerability metrics is linked to the ability to quantify climate-related risks. Has there been any consideration of adding an adoption provision regarding vulnerability metrics with the same timeline?
No. So as some of you may know, we don't define vulnerable in NZCS. We have had a fair few conversations about what that means, but at the moment that has not been an issue that has been raised sufficiently with us to warrant any further extension or any change to the standards.
And just a question around the disclosure or reporting adoption provision. If an entity didn't use it this year, could they use it for the next 2 years?
So it's linked to your reporting periods. So you could not use it. So it's in the standard. The reporting adoption provisions are defined as your first reporting period, your second reporting period, etc. So it depends when you have come into the regime. So for example, you could decide to pick up, if an adoption provision was available for, say, 5 reporting periods, you could pick it up in your first reporting period, your second reporting period. You could not pick it up in your third and fourth, and you could decide to pick it up again in your fifth. But it really relates back to the entity's reporting period and when it started reporting.
Great, thank you. And one on the guidance on exclusions. So the recent XRB guidance on exclusions provides guidance and clarification on the acceptable rationale for exclusions. For example, access to data and where methodologies are not available. Given this, entities could use this guidance in their reporting of Scope 3 emissions and exclusions. Would this be sufficient for CREs to disclose in the form of exclusions, thereby not needing to use the adoption provisions? A long question.
Do you want to take this one, Caroline?
Yes, so by this, we are saying yes on the exceptional rationale. So yes, if it is an acceptable rationale for exclusions under the guidance, then yes, that is an my understanding is yes, that would be an acceptable rationale for exclusion. So it's sort of an exclusion from the boundary of what you're reporting rather than an adoption provision, which means that you don't need, which is disclosure of something that you should be reporting. So it's sort of at that first level on the actual boundary of what you're actually reporting. So yes, would be the answer. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, so we're really hopeful that guidance series on Scope 3 reporting, some of it's aimed just at, some of it's aimed both at the reporting and the assurance practitioner, is useful. We know that exclusions was really challenging. We know that these boundary things that are really challenging as well. But as I said before, we want people to use it. We want people to feel comfortable with it. So we know that it does take some time. So we really would encourage, if these adoption provision extensions do happen. Same with anticipated financial impacts. We really do encourage you to think about doing that work in-house. Think about your Scope 3, or think about your anticipated financial impacts. How would you disclose them? How would you measure them? What would it look like? In the consultation document, we do talk about, you could use this time for assurance readiness assessments, for example. But these are grey areas with lots of judgment, and we want to give you the time to have those conversations internally about those judgment decisions, because we don't want to get into a situation where people are getting assurance and getting qualified audit opinions, etc., and the whole system is not seen to be valuable.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have at the moment, unless anyone else has any that they want to pop into the chat or the Q&A.
Oh yeah, we've got one. That was the one in the chat. Amazing. Yeah, so please do. Any other questions? We will talk amongst ourselves, Karen, for a minute. If anyone wants to add one. Excellent. Please do keep them rolling in.
one has come in. A guidance on approach to comparatives and trends analysis, especially as it is expected that Scope 3 reporting improves year on year, would be great. For example, as we move from spend-based methods to using actual information, this could change the emissions profile and year-on-year comparisons might not be possible. So I know something that we've sort of talked about in sort of relation to that is guidance on looking at restatements. So I know that's something we're talking about. But yeah, that's really interesting. Did you have any comments on
Yeah,
that?
thank you so much. What I would absolutely encourage is, for us, the only way that we know that there is a problem with the standard or whether there's guidance, etc., that needs to be issued is if we hear about it. So it's very grateful for suggestions. We'll keep Karen and busy. But yeah, really, really grateful for the communication that we get around the standards and guidance support. It really does enable us to do our job. So thank you very much.
Yes, definitely. It's good to know what's happening, and so we can help and support where we can. So based on your discussions with the Society of Actuaries, do you expect your guidance on AFI to significantly change?
No, that's a really great question. No, we do not expect it to change. What we are aware is, when in this area, in climate disclosures, we are asking for disclosure of things that people haven't done before, which is different to financial reporting, where there's been a lot of experience built up over many, many, many years, centuries. And so when it is a new disclosure requirement with a new kind of how to do the thing underneath it, that's when we really want to give some ideas and support around how to do the thing that you then disclose about. So no, definitely don't expect at this stage any different in the disclosure requirement on AFIs itself in NZCS. But we are aware, some of you might know, there's this idea of generally accepted accounting practice. There is a kind of expectation around what disclosures look like that does evolve through the disclosure evolving over time. And so, if all of a sudden, there is an international movement away from quantification of anticipated financial impacts, full stop, we would really have to think about that and how that would fit into the New Zealand regime. But no, the work with the New Zealand Society of Actuaries is really kind of thinking, how do we support entities to think about this work to then disclose according to the standard as written.
Excellent, thank you. And one more question. So if an entity reports selected Scope 3 emissions and chooses to get assurance over those, does the assurance practitioner need to assure under NZSAE1? So that's a very good question. So NZSAE1 is our temporary domestic assurance standard for the assurance of the disclosures in the greenhouse gas disclosures in the climate statements. The answer to that is yes. If they do choose to have assurance over a subset or all Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, then yes, that assurance engagement would need to be carried out in in accordance with our standard NZSAE1. We have one more question. Kia ora, there is a risk that NZ-based guidance leads NZ to being out of step with Australia and internationally. Are you working closely with those regulators for consistency?
Yes, so we have a lot of Trans-Tasman connections. So we have the chair of the XRB board is on the Australian Financial Reporting Council, and then we also have an Australian member on each of the technical standard setting boards. So there is an Australian member on our Sustainability Reporting Board. We have a member on the Australian Accounting Standards Board, and vice versa also for assurance. And then we also have very close relationships with the staff, and then the regulators also have very close relationships. So we are paying very, close attention to what the requirements are in Australia. One of the things we have to think about really carefully as the XRB is we want our standards to be internationally aligned but locally relevant. So we do have to think about whether the standards, an international standard or a standard that might be used in another jurisdiction is suitable and appropriate for New Zealand entities. The New Zealand government sets the who reports, and then we have to think about what is appropriate for that who to report. So we are very conscious that, for example, IFRS S2 was initially intended, was built with the very, very large multinational in mind, not built with a small entity in mind. And so we have to think, we're very interested, for example, to see how those proportionality mechanisms that are in the Australian standard and IFRS S2 play out. Would they be suitable for the size of entity that we have here in New Zealand? So yeah, it's an ongoing issue. There's a lot of changes happening in all jurisdictions around, as the implementation goes through. So yeah, paying very close attention and talking a lot.
Great. No questions at the moment.
So, well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We hope that was really useful. Please do go and answer the questions in the online survey. We absolutely need your feedback to be able to make a recommendation to the boards here at the XRB so they can make a decision. And as I said, we will be aiming to communicate the decision of the consultation as soon as possible, and definitely in October. So very much appreciate. We know it's another consultation on top of a lot of consultations. But we're hoping that this is as simple as possible for you to complete and give us your feedback. Thank you for joining us today. Please email us, get in touch if you have any further questions, and have a great weekend. Thanks all.
Thank you.